The teller slid the statement across the counter without a word. $41. That was what was left of 31 years of saving. I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there looking at that number the way you look at something that can't possibly be real, waiting for it to change, waiting for the room to correct itself. It didn't. I want you to understand who I was before that morning. I was the woman who balanced her checkbook every Sunday at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and a ledger I'd kept for 9 years. I had never once been late on a bill. Not once in 40 years. That wasn't pride, it was just who I was. It was the thing I knew about myself when everything else got uncertain. Then I had a stroke. And in a hospital bed, still shaking, still unable to hold a pen without it sliding, I signed a document my son Curtis put in front of me. He said it was temporary. Just until I got back on my feet. He said it like it was nothing. Like it was the obvious, loving thing to do. That was 3 years before that Tuesday morning at the bank. For 3 years I accepted the summaries he printed on plain paper. For 3 years I said thank you. For 3 years I told myself that needing help once didn't mean I had stopped being capable of understanding my own life. Sitting in that bank lobby, I asked the teller one question I had never thought to ask before. I asked if there were any other accounts associated with my Social Security number. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I already knew. Something cold moved through me, not panic, not grief. Certainty. The kind that arrives before your mind has finished catching up. There was one more account. She said it the way you'd say anything routine, a fact, a line on a screen, something that simply existed. But her eyes moved to mine for just a moment, and I understood that she had seen this before. Not my story specifically. But this kind of story. I asked her to print everything. Every transaction. 3 years. She didn't ask why. She just turned back to her screen and began. I stood at that counter and I thought about the ledger in my kitchen drawer. The one I'd kept since 1994. Dark green cover, spiral bound, the pages near the front gone soft from handling. Every entry in my own handwriting, dates, amounts, the name of the bill, the balance after. 9 years of Sundays at that kitchen table. Coffee cooling beside me. The particular quiet of a Sunday morning when the week hasn't started yet and the numbers still make sense. I had given that up without a fight. Not because I was foolish. Because I was frightened, and he was my son, and the pen kept sliding out of my hand. The teller came back with a folder. She slid it across the counter the same way she'd slid the statement, carefully, without ceremony. I thanked her. I picked it up. I walked out through the glass doors into the parking lot, and I sat down in my car, and I did not start the engine. The second account had been opened 6 weeks after my stroke. I found that detail on the 3rd page. The opening date, the account number, the Social Security number, mine, and a signature on the authorization form that I stared at for a long time. It had the shape of my name. The general shape. The way a copy of a copy loses something in each generation. I have signed my name thousands of times. I know what it looks like. That was not it. The account had a linked address. A street I didn't recognize, in a state I had never lived in. I sat with that for a moment. Tennessee. I have never been to Tennessee. Then I started reading the transfers. They came out of my primary account every month, regular as a utility bill, and they were never round numbers. Never 500 even, never 1,000. Always 480. Or 960. Or 370. Amounts that looked like expenses. Amounts that looked like nothing in particular if you weren't paying attention. I had not been paying attention. I had been trusting the summaries printed on plain paper, the ones Curtis brought folded in his jacket pocket, the ones that showed a balance that looked reasonable and a list of categories, utilities, groceries, prescriptions, that I never thought to verify against anything real. I had been tired. That is the honest word for it. Not incompetent. Tired. There is a difference, and I want to say that plainly because I spent a long time confusing the two. I turned to the last page of the printout. And that was when I saw the total. $53,420. Gone. In 31 months. From an account I had never stopped believing was mine. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. Long enough that a woman knocked on my window to ask if I was all right. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. But I was not falling apart either, and that, I think, was the moment I understood that whatever came next, I was going to be the one who decided it. I called Patrice. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, and I said, "I'm in the bank parking lot and I need you to listen to me for a minute." Patrice Odom has been my friend for 26 years. She spent 22 of those years working in bank compliance. She has a particular kind of stillness when something is serious. She stops doing whatever else she was doing and she simply listens. I heard her set something down on a counter. I told her about the $41. I told her about the second account. I told her about Tennessee. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Don't go home yet. Don't call Curtis. Come to my house." That was all. No alarm in her voice. No pity. Just a direction, clear and immediate, from someone who already understood what I was still trying to name. I started the car. On the drive to Patrice's house, I passed the turn I would have taken to go home. I thought about what was waiting there, the kitchen, the drawer, the green ledger that hadn't been touched in 3 years because Curtis said he was handling it, because I had believed that handling it was a kindness rather than a transaction. I thought about my sister Delia. She had called me in October. I remembered because she always called on my birthday and I had thought it was early. But when I tried to call her back, something was wrong with the voicemail. Curtis had told me the phone company updated their system. He'd said he'd sort it out. He never sorted it out. I hadn't spoken to Delia in, I counted the months as I drove, 14 months. I pulled into Patrice's driveway and sat there for a moment with the folder in my lap and the engine running. 3 years of transactions. A signature that wasn't mine. A house and estate I'd never visited. A sister I hadn't been able to reach. I turned off the engine. I was not afraid of what I was about to find out. That surprised me. I had expected fear and instead I felt something else, a cold, clarifying thing, like a window being opened in a room that has been shut too long. I got out of the car and walked to Patrice's door. What I found inside that folder over the next 2 days would answer every question I had carried for 3 years without knowing I was carrying it. And it would answer one question I hadn't thought to ask yet, one that changed the shape of everything. But I wasn't ready for that question yet. Not quite. Patrice opened the door before I knocked. She had seen my car in the driveway and she knew, the way old friends know, that I had not come for coffee. She didn't ask me anything. She just stepped aside, and I walked in, and I set the folder on her kitchen table. She made tea while I spread the pages out. 3 years of transactions, printed on standard white paper by a teller who had no idea what she was handing me. The pages covered the entire table. Patrice set a mug beside my hand and sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Tell me what you've already seen." I told her about the second account. The one I had never opened. The one linked to an address in a state I had never visited. The one that had been receiving money from my primary account every single month for 31 months. Patrice was quiet for a moment. She had spent 22 years in bank compliance. I watched her face and I saw the moment she recognized the pattern, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of grim confirmation, the look of someone who has seen this before and hoped never to see it again. She pulled the pages toward her and began to sort them by date. Her hands were steady and efficient. Mine were not, so I let her work. "Do you see the transfer amounts?" she said after a few minutes. I looked. The numbers were irregular. Not round figures, not 500, not 1,000. 480. 730. 960. Amounts that looked almost random. "They're not random," Patrice said, before I could ask. "They're calculated. Anything over $10,000 in a single transaction has to be reported to the federal government. But there are also patterns that trigger review at lower amounts, consistent round numbers, regular timing. Whoever set this up knew that. These amounts stay just irregular enough, just small enough, to avoid automatic flags." I sat with that for a moment. This was not carelessness. This was not someone who had borrowed a little and meant to pay it back. This was someone who had learned the rules well enough to work around them. Someone who had taken their time. Someone who had been patient, more patient, I realized, than I had ever given him credit for being. I thought about Curtis sitting across from me at my kitchen table for 3 years, handing me those printed summaries on plain paper. Patient. Reassuring. Always with an answer ready. I thought about how I had thanked him. Patrice turned to the second account's opening documents. She studied the signature line for a long time without speaking. Then she slid the page across to me and pointed. I looked at the signature. I looked at it for a long time. It was not my handwriting. I have signed my name the same way for 50 years, a looping M, a long descending H, the same small flourish at the end that my mother always said looked like a question mark. This signature had none of that. It was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had practiced, but it was not mine. "Miriam," Patrice said quietly, "do you understand what that means?" I understood. It meant that whatever story Curtis had been telling himself, that he was helping, that he was managing, that he was doing what needed to be done, it had required him to sign my name to a document I had never seen. It had required him to decide, at some specific moment on some specific day, to write my name in his own hand and present it as mine. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect tears at a moment like this, and I had none. What I felt was something colder and more useful, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping you've misread something. We kept working. And then Patrice said, quietly, "There's something else I need to show you." She had pulled up the property records on her laptop while I was still studying the signature. She turned the screen toward me. I looked at the address. I looked at the names on the deed. I looked at the purchase date. I looked at the down payment amount. $42,000. I had started that 3-year period with just over $61,000 in savings. Money I had set aside over decades, not from a large income, but from discipline. From not spending what I didn't have. From the Sunday ledger ritual that Curtis had called old-fashioned and I had called mine. $42,000. A vacation home in North Carolina. 3 bedrooms. Listed in the names of Curtis Allen Holt and Sandra Marie Holt. I sat back in Patrice's kitchen chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I thought about a specific afternoon, maybe 8 months after my stroke, when I had mentioned to Curtis that I'd like to replace the water heater before winter. He had said, gently, that money was a little tight right now, that my recovery costs had added up, that we should wait until spring. I had nodded and put on an extra sweater, and I had waited until spring. There had been no tight money. There had been a down payment on a house in North Carolina. While I was wearing an extra sweater in my own home, they were signing paperwork on a vacation property. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. Patrice refilled my tea without asking. Then she said, "There's still one more thing." She had been looking at my phone records. I hadn't asked her to, but she had thought to request them when she'd pulled the other documents, and now she set a single page in front of me. My phone plan had been changed 14 months ago. Downgraded to a basic tier. The voicemail feature had been removed from the account. I thought about October. My birthday. Delia calling. I thought about all the times over the past year that I had assumed Delia was simply busy, or that she had decided not to push, or that the distance between us had grown so naturally that neither of us had noticed. I had told myself that was just what happened with time. It was not what happened with time. Curtis had taken my voicemail. He had taken my sister's voice and replaced it with silence, and I had filled that silence with explanations that let him off the hook. That detail, the voicemail, was the one that finally made my hands shake. Not the money. Not the forged signature. The voicemail. Because the money could almost be explained as greed, which is at least a thing I could name. But removing my voicemail so that my sister's calls disappeared into nothing, that was something else. That was deliberate isolation. That was someone making sure I stayed small and alone and without witnesses. And I had to ask myself, what else had been removed that I hadn't yet thought to look for? I picked up Patrice's phone and I called Delia's number from memory. She answered on the second ring. It was past 11 o'clock. She had been awake. When she heard my voice, she didn't say hello. She said, "Miriam, I have been so worried about you." And I said, "I know. I'm sorry it took me this long." We didn't talk long that night, there was too much to say and I was too tired to say it correctly. But before I hung up, Delia told me that she had called Curtis directly, months ago, after she couldn't reach me. He had told her I was fine but that I preferred not to be bothered with details. That I found phone calls tiring since the stroke. That she shouldn't worry. He had spoken for me. To my own sister. He had described my preferences as if he had invented them, and she had believed him because why would a son lie about his mother's wishes? That night I slept on Patrice's couch. Not because I was afraid to go home, but because I wasn't ready to sit in my own kitchen yet with everything I now knew. I lay in the dark and I made a list in my head. Not of grievances, I had no interest in grievances. A list of what needed to happen, in what order, and what I needed to have in hand before any of it could begin. The transactions. The second account. The forged signature. The deed. The phone records. The 3 years of printed summaries that Curtis had handed me instead of official bank documents, summaries I had kept in a shoebox in my closet because something in me had known, even then, to hold on to paper. I had everything. And Curtis did not know that yet. He was going to sleep that night believing I was still the woman who said thank you for the printed summaries. He was going to wake up the next morning and go about his day. And I was going to let him do that, for a little while longer. Because I had learned something about patience from watching him. And I intended to use it. The next morning, I called the attorney Patrice had recommended. Her name was Renata Osei and she had spent 15 years handling financial exploitation cases involving older adults. Patrice had said she was the kind of lawyer who didn't get loud, she just got thorough. I made an appointment for the following Thursday. Then I drove home, made coffee, and waited. Because there was one thing left I needed to do before I was ready to move. I needed to hear what Curtis would say when he thought he was still in control. I called him that afternoon. I kept my voice easy, a little uncertain, the way I had learned he expected me to sound. I told him I had been to the bank. That there seemed to be some confusion about my balance. That I was probably missing something, but could he come by and help me understand it? He said, "Of course, Mom. I'll be there at 7. He arrived with a folder. That was the first thing I noticed. Not his face, not his voice, the folder. Neat, dark blue, the kind you buy in a pack of 3 at an office supply store. He set it on my kitchen table like it was a gift. Curtis sat down across from me and he explained. He said the balance looked low because he had been moving funds into a short-term investment vehicle on my behalf. He said the returns were good but the money was tied up temporarily, those were his exact words, tied up temporarily, and that I shouldn't worry because everything was accounted for. He opened the folder. There were printed pages inside. Numbers, columns, something that looked official if you didn't look closely. I looked closely. The header on those pages named a financial firm I had never heard of. No address. No account number I recognized. The font was slightly wrong, the kind of wrong you only notice if you've spent 40 years reading real financial documents. I kept my face still. I asked him one question. Can you show me the investment account statements? The ones from the firm itself, the originals, not the summaries? He said he'd bring them next week. I nodded. I thanked him for coming. I walked him to the door. And then I stood in my own kitchen and I understood something I had been circling for days but hadn't let myself say plainly. He had done this before I ever walked into that bank. The folder wasn't something he put together after my call. It was already made. He had been carrying it, or something like it, for months, ready for the day I asked a question he needed to answer. This was not a mistake that grew. This was a plan that had been maintained. I want you to understand what it means to sit across from your own son and watch him hand you fabricated documents with a steady hand and a reassuring voice. There is a particular kind of grief in that moment that has no good name. You are not surprised, not anymore, but you are watching something confirm itself that you had spent years hoping was wrong. And you are keeping your face still, and you are saying thank you, and you are walking him to the door, and the whole time some part of you is still the woman who drove 4 hours in a January ice storm because he called and said he needed her. That part of you does not disappear. You just learn to set it aside for long enough to do what needs to be done. The next morning I called Patrice before 7. I told her about the folder. I told her about the investment firm with no address. I told her what he had said about the funds being tied up. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Miriam. The signature on the second account's opening documents, did you look at it carefully?" I had. I had looked at it the day she and I spread everything across her dining room table. I had looked at it and I had told myself it was just an off day, just my hand being unsteady the way it had been right after the stroke. But I had kept looking at it. And the more I looked, the more certain I became. That signature was not mine. The letter formations were wrong. The way the M broke, I have made that letter the same way since the 7th grade. Whoever signed that document had copied something, maybe my signature from another form, but they had not copied it well enough. Not well enough for a woman who had signed her own name on 31 years of checks and tax returns and property documents. I told Patrice. She said, "That changes the category of what this is." I knew what she meant. A civil complaint for financial exploitation was already serious. But a forged signature on a bank account opened in my name, using my social security number, while I was recovering from a stroke and not fully able to verify what I was signing, that was not a family dispute. That was not a misunderstanding about caregiving boundaries. That was a crime. I sat with that word for a moment. Crime. My son had committed a crime against me. I want to tell you what that feels like, because I think if you've never had to hold that thought about someone you raised, you might imagine it feels like anger. It doesn't. Not at first. It feels like a room you've lived in for years suddenly having no floor. You are standing in a place you thought you knew, and the ground is simply gone. I had fed this man. I had sat beside him in emergency rooms. I had driven 4 hours in a January ice storm because he called and said he needed me. I had signed over access to my accounts from a hospital bed because I trusted that the person handing me the pen was the same boy I had known for 47 years. He had not been that boy for a long time. Maybe he never had been, in the way I needed him to be. Or maybe this was something that had grown slowly in him, the way certain things do, quietly, in the dark, until one day it is simply the shape of who a person is. I didn't know which one it was. I still don't. But I knew this, it did not matter anymore. What mattered was what I had in my possession. 3 years of transaction records. The second account's opening documents with a signature that was not mine. The property deed for a vacation home in a state I had never visited, purchased with money that had been mine. My phone records showing the months of silence while Delia tried to reach me. The shoebox full of Curtis's printed summaries, not official bank documents, never official bank documents, that I had kept without knowing why. I had everything. And on Thursday morning, I drove to Renata Osei's office. Patrice came with me. She didn't say much on the drive over. She didn't tell me what to feel or what to expect. She just drove, and when we pulled into the parking lot she turned off the engine and sat for a moment. Then she said, "You ready?" I thought about the $41. I thought about the folder Curtis had carried into my kitchen like a man who had rehearsed. I thought about Delia's voice, which I hadn't heard in over a year, and what she must have thought when her calls went unanswered, whether she had believed, as Curtis told her, that I preferred not to be bothered. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." We walked in together. I set the shoebox on Renata Osei's desk. She opened it. She began to read. And after about 4 minutes, she looked up at me over her glasses and said something I will not forget. She said, "Mrs. Holt, this is one of the most complete files I've received from a client in 15 years. I had spent 40 years keeping good records." It turned out that had not been a small thing. Renata told me what the next steps would look like. She told me what the civil complaint would contain, what it would be filed with, and what it would require Curtis and Sandra to answer for. She told me that the forged signature would be referred separately, and that a state financial exploitation unit would likely become involved. Then she asked me one question. "Is there anything you want to preserve in terms of your relationship with your son before we file?" I looked at her. I looked at Patrice. I said, "File everything." Renata read for a long time. She did not rush. She turned each page carefully, set it face down, picked up the next one. The office was quiet except for the sound of paper. Patrice sat beside me without moving. I kept my hands in my lap and I did not look away. When Renata finished, she closed the folder. She said, "The signature on the account opening documents is not a close approximation, Mrs. Holt. It doesn't even match your baseline. Whoever signed this was not trying very hard." I had known that since the moment Patrice held the document under the lamp in her kitchen and showed me. But hearing it said aloud, in that office, by a woman who had seen 100 of these cases, something shifted in my chest. Not grief. Not rage. Recognition. This had never been careless. There had never been a moment where Curtis meant well and went too far. He had sat beside my hospital bed while I was still learning to hold a pen again, and he had made a plan. He had looked at his mother, shaking, frightened, grateful for any help, and he had seen an opportunity. That was the last thing I needed to understand. And now I understood it. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, a certified letter arrived at the vacation property in North Carolina. I was not there to see Curtis open it. I don't need to have been. The complaint named him. It named Sandra. It detailed every transfer, 37 months of them, each one calculated to stay below the federal reporting threshold, which Renata noted in the filing as evidence of deliberate structuring. It included the account opening documents with the forged signature. It included the property deed. It included the transaction records I had printed in a bank parking lot on a morning that felt, at the time, like the end of something. It was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Renata filed it with the state. The Financial Exploitation Unit received their copy the same day. That same morning, the same hour, I made sure of it, my accounts moved to a credit union 4 miles from my house. New account numbers. One authorized person. Me. Curtis called my phone at 11:14 that morning. I know because I saw it later. I was not home. I was not available. I was sitting at my sister Delia's kitchen table, eating tomato soup, listening to her tell me about her garden. She had replanted the rose bed. She had been meaning to tell me for months. We talked for 3 hours. When I finally stood up to leave, she held on to my hand a moment longer than necessary. Neither of us said anything about the year of silence. We didn't need to. We both knew whose hands had held that silence in place. People ask me sometimes, or they would, if I told this story out loud, whether I regret waiting so long. Whether I wish I had gone to the bank sooner. Whether I should have pushed back the first time Curtis answered a question that had been directed at me, or the first time Sandra said we've decided about a room in my own house. I've thought about that. What I know is this: the stroke did not make me incompetent. It made me tired. And tired people make reasonable choices, they accept help, they trust family, they sign documents in hospital beds because the alternative is to believe something they are not yet ready to believe. I was not foolish. I was a mother who had raised a son for 38 years and could not immediately accept that the person managing her medication schedule was also managing her into poverty. That is not weakness. That is the specific cruelty of what they did. The $41 was not my lowest point. I want to be clear about that. My lowest point was the evening I sat across from Curtis while he laid out his folder of fabricated documents and I smiled and nodded and said thank you for explaining, because I already knew, and I chose to say nothing, and I understood in that moment that I had become someone who had learned to make herself small in her own kitchen. That was the lowest point. The $41 was the moment I stopped. Patrice was there the morning I signed the complaint. She sat in the chair beside me and she didn't say a word. When it was done, when I had signed my actual signature, the one that was mine, the one no one had forged, she reached over and squeezed my hand once. Just once. That was enough. I drove home alone. I made coffee. I sat in my chair, in my house, with my name on the deed and my money in an account that no one else could touch, and I thought about the women who were sitting in parking lots right now, holding a bank statement they didn't recognize, trying to decide whether what they were feeling was allowed. I want to say something to those women directly. The confusion you feel is not confusion. The thing you are afraid to name is exactly what you think it is. And the fact that it came from someone you loved, someone you raised, someone you trusted with your worst moment, that does not make you wrong. It makes what they did worse. You kept good records once. You knew how to balance something once. That did not leave you. It is still there, waiting, in whatever drawer you stopped opening when you decided it was easier to trust someone else with your own numbers. Go open that drawer. I wonder sometimes how many women are sitting somewhere right now, staring at a printed summary on plain paper, not an official statement, just a summary, just numbers someone else chose to show them, and telling themselves that the balance looks reasonable, that there must be a good explanation, that they are probably just tired and missing something obvious. I was that woman for 3 years. And I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. When was the last time you saw your own account, not a summary, not a printout someone handed you, but the actual statement, from the bank itself, with your name and your number and every transaction listed in full? If you can't remember, that is not a small thing. That is the answer to a question you haven't asked yet. Did you ever have a moment like that, a number, a document, a door that was suddenly locked, where something told you to look closer, and you had to decide whether you were ready to see?